Now don't worry, whenever somebody says Photoshop, I know it sounds like overwhelming because Photoshop is such a intricate program, but we're gonna talk about 3 things that you can do no matter your experience level, and I'm gonna make it really simple for you. I'm gonna explain everything. Tip number 1 is gonna be how to add a really cool sun flare to your picture. Tip number 2 is gonna be how to add a nice sky overlay if your sky is looking kind of boring. And tip number 3 is gonna be how to retouch your skin slightly so it still looks natural and not fake. So if you're ready to figure out how we can take your pictures from good to great in Photoshop, let's dive into it. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I have here 3 images, and in each image I'm gonna show you one Photoshop technique that I use just to level up these pictures, take them to the next level, because that'll make the difference between good and great. And you always want to put in just that little bit of extra detail, you know, just to show that you take your work seriously, that you are, you know, your own artist. And so in each of these, in this picture here, I'm going to add in just an overlay of a sky. In this picture here, I'm going to bring in a sun flare. And in this one here, I'm going to use a really cool technique called frequency separation to retouch some of this skin here that I just look really tired. I look like I didn't get much sleep, and yeah, I just want to fix some of this redness in under my eyes. And the technique that I'm going to show you is really cool because it leaves your skin looking natural, not like you just face-tuned it with a smoothing tool and it looks, you know, fake. So we'll start with this one, and I'm going to right-click, edit in Photoshop. So we are in Photoshop now, and I want to add a beautiful sky overlay to this image. I just want to explain the very, very basics of Photoshop, because if you're coming in and this is your first time in Photoshop, a lot of the things I might explain won't make any sense. For the sky, we are going to be using the gradient tool right here. Its shortcut is Command, or just press G, and it'll pull up the gradient. So the gradient tool allows us to fade our images to blend things together nicely, and that's what we want to do with our sky. So what's going to happen is I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded, and that's going to pull up some stock imagery that I've actually already purchased, and I purchased these on Etsy. So you can go on Etsy, you can go to Adobe Stock, you can anywhere that sells. I usually find Etsy has the best deals. I got this whole thing I think for like $5 or something like that, like between $5 and $10, really affordable. You just go to Etsy and type in sky overlays, and I'm gonna find the one that I like the best. So for our image, I actually really like this one because the suns line up nicely, the lighting is the same, and I have dogs barking in the background, sorry about that. So just go Place, and we're gonna adjust this to be kind of where we want it to be. Line this up a little bit, somewhere around there. And as you can see on the right side, it created a new layer. And this is good because we don't ever want to work on our background layer. We always want to have separate layers. So one thing about Photoshop is that you can do different actions and different color grades and different embedding images and placing new images all on separate layers, so that if you mess up or if something happens where you're like, oops, I didn't mean to do that, all you have to do is delete the layer rather than going to your background image and having to undo up here. You can undo all the actions you make. It's kind of a pain to have to go through and undo and redo everything, versus you could just delete a layer and redo it. So now we've added the sky here, right? So obviously this needs some blending. We need to mask this in properly. And in order to mask it, you take the layer, the new layer you created, and you add a layer mask. And adding a mask allows us to make adjustments on only this layer. So this mask tool is in the bottom right next to FX. It's the rectangle with a circle in it. you just add a layer mask. And what this does is it just creates a blank white layer that allows you to make adjustments on this specific layer. So we're going to come back over and take our gradient tool, and we are going to work on this layer mask. And we are going to start wherever we want the blending to be. So I want the blending, I don't want it to be on my head. So I'm going to start about right here, and I'm just going to bring this gradient line up and blend that in. And it blends the sky really nicely into this image and gives it this really natural feel, but it also like took away quite a bit of these clouds. So what I want to do is, and you can see the work you're doing, press Alt and you click on this layer mask, you can see sort of the adjustments you're making. And let's say like and you press Alt again and it'll go back, and let's say you wanted to like redo this. You can press Command Z and you can redo click the layer mask, come back to your gradient tool, and you wanted it to be down a little bit further, like right here. You know, then it's not quite, it's still cutting across my head, and I can paint this out, but I just want to make this easier on myself and just start from where I don't want this to be. So we'll come up like this. And now it's not running through my head, or if it is, it's like barely, you can barely see it. It's not that noticeable. So what I want to do now is take the brush tool, which is right here, and it's also, you can press B for a shortcut for the brush tool to come up. If I come up to this spot right here, I can adjust the size of the brush. And I just want to kind of paint it, you know, paint this mask back in. So couple other important things are, once you adjust the brush size, you want to make sure the hardness is at 0, because this will just give it a nice little feather around the brush, versus if it's at 100, you can see the difference right here. 100% hardness, 0% hardness, it gives it the soft edges. And then I also want soft, round, pressure, and opacity flow. I want to choose this brush because this just, as I click over, it'll give it just a softer brush stroke rather than a hard brush stroke with these. And then the final thing is, you want to take your flow down. So flow and opacity, these are kind of the intensity level that you're using this tool on. So if I paint and I want to make sure that my foreground is white and my background is black, because the whiteness, if you look over here on the mask, the white is the original image and the black is what's being blended, and the white is where the majority of your image lives. So I want to make sure that when I'm adding stuff back into this image, that I'm working on my layer mask and I'm using a white foreground and a black background. So if you look and you see 100% flow and 100% opacity, and I try to paint this back in, it's going to paint it back in very intensely. It's like I'm painting this image back in to its original format, right? And it just doesn't quite match what I was doing. So if I Command Z that and I lower my flow to about, I don't know, 25, let's call it 30%, then I can just kind of paint in a little bit less intense, but still bring back a lot of these details that I was missing from the gradient. Now I'm able to blend this together nicely, and still, if I want to take away, then I'll just switch my foreground to black, and I can take away from my hair. And you can, it also takes away, if you did too much, you can take it away. But I kind of liked where it was. I just wanted to paint away anywhere that the sky was on my head. So white adds, black takes away. And you can see the changes you're making. If you come over here and you press Alt and you click on this mask, you can see the changes that you're doing. You're adding back in and taking away. So the next thing I want to do is, you see how this whole background is kind of blurred out? And not very much blurred out because I was shooting at kind of a high aperture, but the sky and the blurred out background don't match. So I need to add a slight blur to this sky. So what I want to do is click the layer, come up here to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, And this is just adding a blur to this layer. And I want to find a blur that is similar to the blurred out background. And that almost looks a little too much. Maybe somewhere around 5 or 4.5, maybe 4. Something like that looks really good. Let me see what like 3 looks like. 3.5. Yeah, so that kind of adds a nice blur that matches what the background is and still makes it look realistic. So if you turn this on and off, you can see that we just added a really cool sky, and the lighting is not really affected. You still have that cool sun flare coming through. Just a way to take your image to the next level, add that layer of creativity, and you can use any sky you want. You know, this is a very intense sky. Another thing you can do is like, oh, this is too intense. You can take the opacity right here and just lower it a little bit, and the sky won't be as intense. And you can kind of like do that. You can also lower the fill, and that's it. You can just come over here to save, and it'll save back in Lightroom. Here it goes, right here. So that's before and after. Alright, let's move on. Next up, I want to add a sun flare to this shot, so I am going to edit in Photoshop. Okay, so I've already done all the like color grading and retouching in Lightroom. Here I just want to add the really cool little effects. So the first thing I'm going to do for this is go to File again, Place Embedded, and now I need to go to wherever I have light, my lights package, which is right here, and pick one that I think that would look really cool. Place this one kind of right here. Make that a little bit smaller. Screen, blend mode to screen, so it kind of peaks in this corner right here. Raise it just a little bit, just to give it a cool little flare, sun flare effect. So those are just ways that you can just take your picture to the next level using sun flares. Let's move on to the next one. Save this, and it will save back in Lightroom. You can see it pop up right here. So there's a before, and there's an after. Okay, and the final one, we're just going to retouch our skin just a little bit with a technique called frequency separation. So we're going to edit in Photoshop. Okay, so to explain frequency separation, I'm just going to show you really quickly. What you do is you create 2 layers. Command J, press it twice. We're going to call this layer color. We're going to call this layer texture. And what you do with frequency separation is you want to separate the color information in the image from the actual texture of the photo. So the texture in the skin, the texture in this shirt, and actually another thing I can show you that I'm seeing now is I have a lot of hair on my sweater. So I can just actually pop this off real quick. So what I'm going to do is make a new layer and just call this, you know, like retouch really quickly. And I'm going to work on this layer quickly. I'm going to use a spot healing brush, and you just come over it, and let me delete these real quick. Yeah, there we go. And you just come over these spot healing brushes, and you can just get rid of this hair really fast. The spot healing brush is really powerful. It is content aware, so it basically reads all the information around where you're clicking, and it blends it nicely. So if you just want to get rid of any, you know, acne or any hair, you can do that to get rid of it. So it's much faster than a lint roller. So let's say like I have some acne here and I want to like retouch this slightly. So I just lower that down to that right here. Zoom in a little more. You can get rid of these little pimples. Actually, that's a little too much. I want it to be even smaller. So you want to barely, you just want to have it just big enough to retouch these blemishes. Okay, so that's a really cool tool. Then I want to, after you're done and you're satisfied, you want to merge these layers by pressing Shift, Option, Command E. And it creates a new stamp layer on top of basically everything that you did below here. It stamps it onto a new layer, so you're almost like creating a new picture from scratch with the changes you made on it. So now we're going to go into frequency separation, and I'm going to retouch some of the skin here. So okay, so frequency separation, we want to do those two layers again, layer 1, layer 2. We want to call this one color, we want to call this one texture. What we're doing is we're separating out color and texture. So we want to turn this texture layer off, and we want to click on our color layer, and we want to add a blur. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And what we want to do here is, let's move this radius to 0.1, and let's zoom in a little bit closer to my skin. We want to move our blur radius just high enough to where you can no longer see the texture anymore, but you can still see the color. So if we move it to about 5 for this, and this radius is going to vary based on a lot of different factors. It's going to be different based on the megapixels of your camera. It's going to be different based on the lens you use, the lighting outside. So this radius, don't, you know, take this number and say this is the number for every picture. This is just the number for this picture. It's going to be different for every picture. So we've gotten rid of the texture, but we can still see the color. So that's about where we want it. We press OK, and if you can see, you turn this texture layer back on, it brings the texture back in, but we still haven't separated it out fully. We need to remove the color layer from the texture layer, so we can have two different layers, one for color, one for texture. So you want to turn your texture layer back on, you want to click on it, and you want to go to Image, Apply Image, and what we want to do is pick the color layer, and we want to subtract it from, we want to subtract our texture layer from the color layer. And these numbers here are going to be 2 and 128. And if you're using a really high megapixel camera and you have a 16-bit image, you might benefit a little bit more from actually, instead of adding it, or instead of subtracting it, coming up to add and invert. And keep your offset at 0 and your scale at 2. It's essentially the exact same thing as subtracting it without the invert. But 8-bit images, you would subtract it. 16-bit images, you want to invert and add, and you change your offset to 0. So we'll just press OK here. And then you want to come to this texture layer back down on the right, and you want to change it to linear light. The next thing you want to do is combine these two layers here, and use Command G and just group them and call this frequency separation. Now we've essentially, if you look at each layer individually, you can see that the texture here, this is the texture layer and this is the color layer, but both of them together, if you turn frequency separation off, it looks like your original image. So you didn't make any changes, you just separated your texture and your color. So now all the edits to do, you want to do on the color layer, so you can retain all of the pores and all of the texture in the skin, but you can adjust the color of the skin. So what we want to do here is actually make a new layer on our color layer. So we want to always make a new layer for backup. You know, just in case we mess up, we can just delete this layer without deleting our color layer. So always work on a new layer. Now, in order to fix our skin here, the redness, we want to come to our brush tool. And I want to, obviously we need to make this smaller. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Command Z. We want to make our radius smaller. There we go, right around there. And I want to make sure that we're on a soft round pressure, opacity, and flow brush, and that our flow is about 10%. Let me zoom in just a little bit more. I want to go on our color layer. I'm going to pick this color here and just start to lightly brush over our color. Getting rid of this redness here. And as you can see, all we're affecting is the color layer. We are not affecting the texture. You might be saying that it didn't do anything, but you can come and you can actually see when it's zoomed in, and you can zoom out a little bit and see the difference. Very subtle, but makes a difference. Pretty cool. And those are really it. And I know that it kind of takes a while to create these frequency separation layers over and over and over again. So what I actually did was I recorded my frequency separation as an action, so you don't have to do it. And you can, I'll put the link to this action in the description of this video, so you can just download it and run this frequency separation action on your own in Photoshop. So you don't have to recreate this all the time. So you can have that for free. And that's it. And you can use frequency separation for so many things. I mainly use it to retouch skin, but still keep a natural look to it. Another thing you can use frequency separation for is wherever you have these little transitions on your skin from these blemishes, like red, you know, these red spots. You can just take your lasso tool and actually, let's make a new layer. Always make a new layer. So stamp it here. You just take your lasso tool and kind of circle the areas where you just transition, and you add a Gaussian blur to it, and maybe up like 7 or 8, and you can just blur those transitions to where they blend nicely, so you can see where it was before. That's pretty cool, right? And you can do that even for some of these red spots. Add a blur. That's a little bit too much. I don't want to add that much, because I still want it to look natural. I don't want to take away everything. But yeah, you just blend it nicely. That's another quick way to do it. So you can do it with the brush, or you can do it with this lasso tool, and you just make your skin look clear. So you can zoom out just a little bit, and we can show frequency separation before and after. You can zoom in, and if you come and you end up like way overdoing it on accident, so this is before and after, but if you just blur out your skin way too much and you don't want to like delete or undo anything, you can also come to the opacity, click the layer that you had your lasso tool on, and change the opacity, and you can reduce the amount of blur. So that will also be a way to just, you know, take away some of the intensity of the changes you're making. And that's it. Those are the 3 techniques in Photoshop to take your pictures to the next level. We can save this as well. If you guys have any questions, feel free to DM me on Instagram at trav_white_, and I will be more than happy to answer. Thank you so much for watching this long video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.